I had always trusted Claire. Ours was one of those storybook romances, college sweethearts, married right out of grad school, a couple that friends envied. We built a life together, 2 kids, a beautiful home, everything we ever wanted. I worked in IT, while Claire was a marketing director for a company that constantly sent her on business trips. Also, I thought. It started with a faint hint of suspicion, something small, barely a whisper. She had been distant for a while, more guarded with her phone, and the usual warmth between us felt like it had started to cool. I noticed her leaving the room when certain calls came in, brushing them off with a smile, saying it was just work. I had no reason to doubt her. After all, she had always been loyal, and I had no intention of turning into one of those paranoid husbands who kept tabs on every text. But as the days passed, the sense of unease grew into a shadow over everything we'd built. One evening, while she was on one of her work trips, I couldn't shake off the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. I knew her routine, down to the hours she usually called to say goodnight or give me updates on her schedule. But that night, the calls came later than usual, and when she did call, her voice felt off, distant, as if she was speaking from somewhere else, not just physically, but mentally too. When I asked how her day had gone, she answered with generic responses, ones that felt as rehearsed as a script, absent of her usual warmth. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the instinct gnawed at me. It's strange how intuition works. It doesn't shout, it doesn't offer proof, it just plants a seed of doubt and lets it grow. That night, after we hung up, I couldn't sleep. Her goodnight had felt hollow. I tossed and turned, replaying the conversation in my head, dissecting each word, each pause. By 3 a.m, I was pacing the bedroom, wide awake. I had to know if my suspicions were real or just a figment of an anxious mind. With a sigh, I sat down at my desk and pulled up her work schedule. Her company's portal was something we had both used to coordinate our family plans, and I knew her login from when she'd asked me to handle a scheduling glitch once. It wasn't exactly ethical, but at that moment, the truth felt more important than any boundary. When I finally logged in, I scanned her recent itinerary. It all looked legitimate, but one entry caught my eye: a trip to Orlando for a conference she had mentioned in passing. Orlando! The city she'd never talked about in detail, the trip she had brushed off as just another work obligation. Curiosity and dread gnawed at me. I clicked through emails, credit card transactions, anything that might reveal more. There, among the hotel receipts and meal charges, I found something unsettling. She had dined at an upscale restaurant, a place we had once talked about visiting together. It didn't sit right with me. A work trip usually meant a quick dinner with colleagues or room service, not a fancy meal in the heart of downtown. Then I found the reservation, 2 people, no names, just a record of the table for 2. I sat back, hand shaking, feeling a wave of disbelief. This wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to make me feel like the ground under my feet was shifting. I had to see if there was a pattern, something that could confirm or deny the storm of thoughts spinning in my head. Over the next few days, I took every free moment I had to scour through our online banking, her travel receipts, and even her social media posts. There were gaps in the story, small discrepancies, moments when she seemed to be in one place when she'd told me she'd be in another. And then, there were the messages. The first message that appeared was from someone named Nick. The messages started innocently enough, typical banter between colleagues, small jokes about work projects, complaints about travel logistics. But soon, the tone shifted. They became more personal, filled with inside jokes, compliments about her appearance, references to our little escape. My stomach turned as I read each line. They'd talk about shared nights and secrets, the thrill of sneaking around, and the rush of forbidden moments. Every word hit me like a punch. The life I thought we had, the love I thought we shared, all unraveled in a matter of minutes. It felt surreal, like watching a nightmare unfold while fully awake. My first instinct was rage. I wanted to confront her, to call her right then and demand an explanation, to expose her lies, shatter her deception. But the fury that had built up in me subsided as quickly as it came, leaving behind a cold, clear resolve. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. Not yet. She had built a careful web of deceit, keeping me in the dark for God knows how long. If she thought she could deceive me this easily, she would learn soon enough how wrong she was. Instead of confronting her, I decided to prepare. I would play my role, let her believe that everything was as it always had been. If she wanted to live in her illusion, I'd give her the stage to do just that. But beneath the surface, I'd gather every bit of evidence I needed. I'd let her dig her own grave with each lie, each deceitful "I love you," each plan that she thought she was hiding so well. When she returned home from her trip, I greeted her as always. I smiled, held her close, and listened to her recount her work meetings and networking dinners. I held her, letting the hollow warmth sink in, imagining the man she had been with, the life she'd hidden from me. Her laugh was still the same, her touch familiar, but now, I saw through the facade, the ease with which she slipped into her role as my loving wife. That night, as she fell asleep next to me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. She was lying beside me, close enough to reach out to, but in my heart, I knew she was miles away, wrapped up in her secret life with Nick, while I was left with the shambles of the life we had built. But as the night wore on, a calm sense of determination settled over me. She had made her choice, and now, it was time for me to make mine. I would wait. I would gather proof, bide my time, and when the moment was right, I would let her know exactly what she had destroyed. But it wouldn't be in a fit of anger or a reckless confrontation. No, I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal, to understand the depths of what she had done, and to know that there was no going back. The days passed in a haze of routine and secrets, each one blending into the next as I maintained the charade. Claire seemed oblivious, carrying on as though nothing had changed, filling our evenings with stories from work and laughter with the kids. I played along, every smile hiding the anger boiling beneath my calm facade. She couldn't see the transformation taking place within me, how each day with her lie layered my resolve. She thought I was blind, and that blindness would be her undoing. In those days, I became someone new, a version of myself I hadn't known existed. I began to track every detail, watching her, studying her, taking in the changes. Every lingering glance at her phone, every message she typed out when she thought I wasn't watching, I noticed it all. I learned to read the telltale signs she left in her wake, the slightest hesitations in her voice, the way her smile faltered whenever I mentioned family plans or friends visiting. She was growing careless, assuming she was smarter than me, that her double life was a secret safe from my discovery. In the evenings, when she claimed she had work to finish, I would go through her messages. She always cleared her phone, of course, but she was less thorough with her email. There, buried within her work correspondence, I found remnants of her betrayal, emails to Nick discussing business meetings that didn't exist, notes about lunch breaks that lasted too long, the way she'd type his name just a little too warmly. I saved each email, each lingering compliment, building a damning archive. I wanted her to know that I knew, to watch her face fall as she realized how meticulously I'd catalogued every lie. As my evidence grew, I also began to plan my approach. Confronting her in a private argument wouldn't do, it felt too small, too easy. She needed to feel the consequences of her actions on a much larger stage, to have everything she'd tried so hard to keep hidden brought into the light. I wanted her to understand that trust, once broken, could never be mended, and that every lie she'd told me would be laid bare. But for that, I'd need an audience. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Our anniversary was approaching, and Claire was eager to throw a party, a big one, filled with friends, family, and colleagues. It was, she said, a chance to celebrate everything we'd accomplished, to share our love with everyone who mattered to us. The irony was almost too much to bear, but I smiled, agreeing with her every suggestion, nodding as she planned the details of an evening that would mark the end of everything she had tried to preserve. As the days slipped by, I focused on preparing for the party, but in the background, I continued gathering information. I tracked her phone bill, analyzing the calls, noting the recurring number from her so-called work trips. I memorized the patterns, the times when she'd be texting him, the silence that would follow whenever she came back from those weekends away. It was meticulous, exhausting work, but each detail added to the picture I was building, a picture she'd have no choice but to face when the time was right. The night before the party, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table, finalizing the guest list. Her face was lit with excitement, her eyes bright as she talked about how wonderful it would be to have everyone together, how happy she was to be celebrating with me. I watched her, barely listening to the words, studying the ease with which she lied, her ability to look at me, touch my hand, and smile as if nothing in the world were wrong. "Do you think we should invite Nick?" she asked casually, glancing down at the list. "You've met him a few times. He's been a big help to me on those work trips." The gall of it. I kept my expression neutral, nodding thoughtfully. "Sure, why not? If he's been such a support, I'd love for him to be there." She smiled, satisfied, oblivious. That night, as we lay in bed, she snuggled close, draping her arm over me, whispering that she couldn't wait for tomorrow, for everyone to see how much we loved each other. I lay stiffly beside her, my mind elsewhere, planning every step of the following evening. The day of the party, I arrived home early to help her set up, arranging tables, bringing out the food, setting the atmosphere for what she imagined would be a celebration of our marriage. I watched her, this woman I'd once thought would be by my side for life, laugh and joke as she set out wine glasses, hummed as she fixed the flowers in the centerpiece. She floated around the room, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, and I let her revel in her false happiness. Guests arrived as evening fell, filling the house with laughter and conversation. Old friends, family members, colleagues, everyone who mattered to us was there, mingling, sharing stories, enjoying the carefully crafted illusion of a perfect evening. I made my rounds, shaking hands, welcoming people, keeping my tone light, while inside, every nerve was wound tight, ready for the moment I would unravel the web of lies Claire had spun around me. I spotted Nick almost immediately. He was as I had expected, tall, charming, the type who flashed a casual smile and wore the air of confidence like a second skin. He greeted me with the polite indifference of a man who had no idea his secrets were about to be exposed. Claire, ever the gracious host, introduced him to our friends, bringing him into the fold, laughing at his jokes, casting sidelong glances when she thought no one was looking. But I was looking. I noticed it all. As the evening wore on, I waited patiently, biding my time. My hand tightened around my glass as I watched Claire laugh, her arm casually brushing Nick's as she leaned in to share a quiet joke. She thought she was clever, thought that the dim lights and the hum of laughter around us masked the betrayal in every glance she threw his way. But the moment had come, and she was about to learn the cost of her deception. When there was a lull in the conversation, I stepped forward, clearing my throat, catching everyone's attention. Claire looked over, her eyes alight with curiosity, assuming I was about to make a toast to her, to us, to this facade we'd kept up for so long. But instead, I began to speak, my voice calm, every word carefully measured. "I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight," I started, looking around the room, taking in the faces of those who thought they knew us, who thought they were witnessing the celebration of a perfect marriage. "It means a lot to have all of you here, friends, family, colleagues. Tonight is a special night, after all." I paused, locking eyes with Claire. Her smile wavered, a hint of uncertainty flashing across her face, and for the first time, I saw the realization begin to dawn in her eyes. She shifted, as though about to interrupt, but I held up a hand, silencing her. This was my stage now. The room fell silent, a thick stillness settling over the guests as they waited for me to continue. Claire stood frozen, her smile faltering as she glanced around, sensing the sudden tension. I kept my gaze on her, watching her face for every flicker of emotion, every spark of understanding that would come as the truth unfolded. She had hidden her secrets well, but tonight, there would be nowhere to hide. "Claire and I have been through so much together," I began, my voice even, holding back the torrent of anger that threatened to break through. "We've shared a lot of love, dreams, and memories. We built this life together." I paused, letting the words sink in. "And part of that life," I continued, my eyes never leaving hers, "is honesty, trust, the foundation of any marriage, right?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her eyes darted to the guests, then back to me, a flicker of panic beginning to show. I saw her knuckles whiten as she gripped her wine glass, her fingers trembling slightly. Still, I continued, unflinching. For years, I thought we were solid. I thought we shared everything, that we had no secrets between us. My voice grew harder, the mask of calm starting to crack. But over the past few months, I've come to realize that not everything was as it seemed. It's amazing how easily some people can hide the truth behind a smile, behind a kiss, behind every "I love you." I let that sit, casting a glance at the crowd. Friends and family exchanged worried looks, their smiles fading as confusion began to take root. Even Nick shifted uncomfortably, looking from me to Claire, his expression wary. Claire's face was turning pale, her eyes wide with a desperate, silent plea. But I ignored her. You see, sometimes you learn that the person you've trusted most has been lying to you. That while you're busy working, raising kids, and being faithful, they've been doing things behind your back. I took a steadying breath, my gaze still fixed on her. Things they think they've hidden so well. Claire finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, trembling. Can we talk about this privately? She managed, trying to step closer to me, her eyes begging me to stop. But I wasn't finished, and I was done keeping secrets for her sake. Oh, don't worry, Claire, I replied, my voice cold. This is as public as it needs to be. You see, everyone deserves to know who they're dealing with, especially when someone's been so duplicitous. I turned to face the crowd, my voice ringing out clearly. I'd like to introduce you all to Nick, the man my wife has been spending her work trips with for quite some time now. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Nick, who looked like he'd been hit by a truck. He stumbled back a step, a look of pure shock on his face as he glanced at Claire, who stood frozen, horror etched across her features. The whispers started, low murmurs spreading through the crowd as friends and family tried to process what I'd just revealed. Nick, why don't you tell everyone about those work meetings you've been having with my wife? I continued, my tone mocking. Or how she's been sneaking away to see you, lying to everyone, pretending to be the perfect wife. How long has it been, Nick? A year? 2. Nick's face flushed deep red, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. He looked to Claire, his eyes pleading, but she was too stunned to speak, her hands covering her mouth as she took in the reality of her lies laid bare before everyone she knew. Finally, he managed to stammer out a response, his voice weak, barely audible. It's not what you think, he mumbled, casting a frantic look around the room. We. I mean, Claire and I. I cut him off, my tone sharper than ever. Oh, it's exactly what I think, Nick. You see, I know everything. Every single detail. I've seen the messages, the hotel receipts, the reservations for dinners and meetings. You really thought I'd never find out? Claire took a step forward, her voice cracking as she tried to speak. Please, let's talk about this, just the two of us. Her voice was a desperate plea, her face etched with panic and shame. This doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be what, Claire? I shot back, anger finally bleeding through my words. Doesn't have to be public? You didn't seem to mind lying to me in private, sneaking off, building a double life while I was back here, trusting you, believing in you. Why should I care now about sparing you this humiliation? She reached out a hand, but I stepped back, refusing her touch. Her face crumpled, tears forming in her eyes, but I felt nothing. The betrayal, the lies, it had hardened me. And now, all I felt was a grim satisfaction watching her come undone in front of everyone she'd tried to deceive. Turning to the guests, I raised my glass, my voice steady. To honesty, I said, my tone dripping with irony. To trust. And to never underestimating the truth. I took a long sip, savoring the bitter taste of the moment, then set my glass down. People began to murmur, their faces reflecting a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Family members looked away, some shaking their heads in disappointment. Friends muttered under their breaths, the words betrayal and affair floating in the air like toxic clouds. Claire's mother covered her mouth, looking as though she might faint. A few friends of Nick shuffled awkwardly, trying to distance themselves from the spectacle, while others stared at him with open contempt. And Claire, she just stood there, as if rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. She reached out once more, a faint, desperate whisper escaping her lips. "I'm sorry, please." But her words meant nothing to me now. She was the one who'd chosen this path, who'd lied to my face, betrayed our family, dragged our life into the dirt. Her apology was as empty as the promises she'd made, as hollow as the vows we'd exchanged so many years ago. When I finally turned to leave, the silence broke, the murmur of voices growing louder, more insistent. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the pity, the judgment, or the looks of disgust directed at her and Nick. I'd done what I came here to do. The truth was out, and nothing she could say or do would change it. As I stepped out into the night, the cool air hit me, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. The burden of her lies was no longer mine to bear. The love I'd once had for her, the dreams we'd shared, they felt distant, like memories from another life. I'd built my life around someone who didn't exist, someone who'd used my trust as a cover for deceit. But now, that person was gone, her illusions shattered, her mask forever broken. In the quiet of the evening, I realized that I was free. And while the pain of betrayal would linger, I knew that someday it would fade, replaced by something stronger, something unbreakable. I had faced the worst, seen the truth in its rawest form, and I had survived. There was nothing left to fear. So, as I walked away from that house, from that life, I did so without regret, without hesitation. I was done. I left that night with the weight of betrayal lifted, a sense of finality settling over me as I walked away from the life we'd built. But even as I turned the page, a strange hollowness filled the spaces where my rage had been. There was an emptiness I hadn't anticipated, one that lingered in the quiet moments, in the silence of my now empty home. I'd exposed her, torn down her lies, and walked away victorious, or so I'd thought. But the victory felt shallow, a fading echo of satisfaction that didn't seem to hold the peace I'd expected. Days turned to weeks, and though I'd taken the steps toward rebuilding, the scars of betrayal refused to heal as neatly as I'd hoped. People offered support, friends who understood, family members who said all the right things, but none of it filled the void. I would come home, sit in the silence of an empty house, and feel the weight of all that had been lost pressing down on me. I thought of the kids, who were still adjusting, their lives uprooted by something they didn't understand. I thought of the family I'd wanted, the future I'd imagined, and saw it slipping further from my grasp with each passing day. One evening, as I sat in the dim glow of the living room, an unexpected message lit up my phone. It was Claire. My instinct was to ignore it, to let her words fade into the void, but something in me couldn't resist. Her message was simple, a single sentence: "Please, meet me, just once." I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the delete button. But instead of pushing it away, I found myself typing back, agreeing to meet her the next night. I told myself it was closure, that I'd listen to what she had to say, let her speak her piece, and walk away for good. But a part of me wondered if I needed this too, if I needed to hear the truth from her lips, to let go of the last thread still tying me to our broken life. When I arrived at the small cafe where we'd agreed to meet, I found her waiting, her face pale and drawn, the familiar spark gone from her eyes. She looked up when I approached, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had once loved, the woman I thought would be my forever. She gestured to the seat across from her, and I sat down, unsure of what to expect, unsure if I even wanted to hear what she had to say. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I know that doesn't change anything, but I need you to know. I never wanted to hurt you like this." Her hands trembled as she spoke, and though I wanted to hold on to my anger, I felt it slipping, replaced by a hollow ache that words couldn't fill. "Then why did you do it?" I asked, my voice quiet, almost pleading. "Why throw it all away?" She looked down, her eyes filling with tears, and took a shaky breath. "I don't know. I thought I wanted something different, something new. I thought maybe there was a part of me missing, that if I found it, I'd feel whole. She shook her head, wiping her eyes. But I was wrong. I was so wrong, and now I've lost everything. Her words hung between us, each one heavy with regret, with a pain that felt too deep to touch. I listened, feeling the edges of my own anger soften, but I couldn't bring myself to respond, to offer her the absolution she seemed to need. Instead, I simply sat there, letting her words fill the silence. We spoke for hours, more honestly than we ever had before. She told me about the emptiness she'd felt, the pressures she'd buried, the mistakes she'd made. I found myself speaking, too, confessing the ways I had retreated into my own work, the moments I had ignored, the signs I hadn't wanted to see. It was a conversation that tore down the last walls between us, one that forced us to face the truth we'd both been running from. As the night wore on, we sat in silence, both of us feeling the weight of everything that had been lost. I could see the remorse in her eyes, the regret that no amount of apology could erase. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she took mine, her touch hesitant, searching. I didn't pull away. Maybe in another life, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. Maybe we could have done it right. I nodded, the sadness settling deep within me, a sadness that no victory or revenge could ever mend. Maybe. We stood, a sense of finality in the air, and I watched her walk out, her figure disappearing into the night. I lingered for a moment, feeling the weight of everything settle over me, knowing that this was truly the end. When I returned home, the house felt different, heavier somehow. I poured myself a drink, sitting in the quiet, letting the stillness surround me. I reached for my phone, scrolling through the messages, finding the ones I'd saved as proof of her betrayal. And as I looked at them, at the words that had once fueled my anger, I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of loss. Days later, I received a call that shattered whatever was left of my world. It was her mother, her voice barely a whisper, filled with an anguish that stole the breath from my lungs. Claire had taken her own life. The news hit me like a wave, pulling me under, filling me with a grief so profound that I could hardly breathe. I found myself collapsing onto the floor, the weight of it crushing me, pressing down until I couldn't move. She was gone, the woman I'd once loved, the woman I had hated, the woman I had spent my life with. And now, all that was left were memories, fragments of a life we'd built together, pieces that could never be put back together. The funeral was a blur, a haze of faces, of murmured condolences and whispers of sympathy. I stood by her casket, staring down at the woman I'd once known, feeling the full weight of what had been lost, what we had both destroyed in our own ways. Friends and family passed by, offering words of comfort, but none of it reached me. I was lost, adrift in a sea of grief, knowing that no amount of closure could ever mend the brokenness that filled me. As the last guest left, I stood alone, a hollow shell of the man I'd once been, staring into the emptiness that stretched before me. The revenge, the anger, it all felt meaningless now, swallowed by a sadness that left me numb. I thought of the life we could have had, the love we had once shared, and felt the weight of a future that could never be. In the end, there was no closure, no victory, no satisfaction in her downfall. Only silence, only regret, and the ache of a love that had been lost forever.